The revolutionary fever that has consumed the modern world is not what it appears to be. Behind the supposedly secular ideologies that promise earthly paradise lies an ancient spiritual disorder, one that I've spent decades investigating in its classical and modern manifestations. What we witness in Marxism, National Socialism, and contemporary revolutionary movements is not political innovation, but the return of Gnostic consciousness structures that have plagued humanity for 2 millennia. These movements share a fundamental pattern: the claim to possess esoteric knowledge that will transform human nature itself and create heaven on earth. Yet every attempt to immanentize the escheaton, to realize the ultimate meaning of existence within history, produces the opposite of its promise. The spiritual disease that infected early Christianity through Gnostic heresies has returned in secular dress, corrupting political movements with the same promise of salvation through special knowledge. Today, as new revolutionary movements emerge with the same Gnostic structure, we must understand why this pattern repeats and how it can be recognized and resisted. The stakes could not be higher. The survival of human order itself depends on our ability to diagnose the spiritual disease at the heart of revolutionary consciousness. Chapter 1: The Ancient Gnostic Pattern in Modern Dress. What transforms political movements into revolutionary religions? Through my investigations spanning decades of exile and scholarly work, I've discovered that revolutionary movements share the fundamental structure of ancient Gnosticism, a spiritual disorder that emerged in the early centuries of Christianity and has returned to dominate modern consciousness. The Gnostic believes he possesses secret knowledge about the nature of reality that sets him apart from ordinary humanity. This knowledge supposedly reveals that the world as it exists is fundamentally evil or illusory, created by a false god or corrupt demiurge. Only through special insight can humanity be liberated from this cosmic prison and achieve its true divine destiny. Modern revolutionary movements exhibit precisely this pattern with remarkable consistency. The Marxist claims to possess scientific knowledge of historical laws that reveal capitalism as a system of exploitation that must be overthrown through proletarian revolution. The National Socialist proclaims racial knowledge that exposes democracy as Jewish deception designed to corrupt the pure Aryan spirit. The contemporary progressive believes in social justice theories that reveal Western civilization as irredeemably oppressive, requiring total transformation through critical consciousness. In each case, the revolutionary possesses gnosis, special knowledge that ordinary people lack, which grants him authority to reshape human existence according to his vision. This Gnostic structure explains why revolutionary movements are immune to empirical refutation and logical criticism. When communist economies fail to produce prosperity, it's because true communism hasn't been tried or because saboteurs prevented its realization. When National Socialist policies produce disaster and moral horror, it's because they were betrayed by enemies or because the racial transformation was incomplete. When progressive reforms increase the very problems they claim to solve, it's because the reforms didn't go far enough or because systemic oppression remains too deeply embedded. The gnosis cannot be wrong because it's not really about the world at all, it's about the revolutionaries' sense of spiritual superiority over the masses trapped in false consciousness. The pattern reveals itself most clearly in the revolutionaries' relationship to time and history. Unlike traditional politics, which accepts the limitations of human nature and seeks incremental improvement within existing conditions, Gnostic politics promises total transformation of the human condition itself. The revolutionary moment will split history into before and after, creating a new kind of human being freed from the constraints that have limited previous generations. This is why revolutionary movements inevitably become totalitarian. They cannot tolerate any aspect of human existence that doesn't conform to their vision of the new man they intend to create. Chapter 2: Why Secular Movements Become Religious Crusades. The puzzle of modern revolutionary movements deepens when we observe how supposedly secular ideologies develop all the characteristics of fanatical religions. This transformation is not accidental but inevitable, given the Gnostic structure that underlies revolutionary consciousness. When movements claim to possess ultimate truth about human existence and history's meaning, they necessarily assume religious authority over their followers' souls, demanding not merely political allegiance but total spiritual submission. Consider how Marxism evolved from economic theory into a comprehensive worldview that governed every aspect of life in communist societies. Marx's scientific socialism quickly developed sacred texts requiring orthodox interpretation, heretical deviations demanding punishment, and inquisitions to purge doctrinal errors. The Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital became scripture, party leaders became prophets of historical necessity, and deviation from orthodox interpretation became sin against the proletariat. The same pattern emerged in National Socialism, which began as political nationalism but became a mystical faith in racial destiny that demanded total spiritual submission to the Volk and its Führer. This religious transformation occurs because Gnostic movements must fill the spiritual vacuum they create by destroying traditional sources of meaning and transcendence. When revolutionary consciousness rejects the transcendent God of classical and Christian civilization, it doesn't eliminate the religious impulse but redirects it toward imminent goals. The movement itself becomes the vehicle of salvation, its leaders become prophets or incarnate gods, and its eventual triumph becomes the second coming that will redeem human suffering and establish the kingdom of heaven on earth. The Gnostic revolutionary cannot tolerate the tension between temporal and eternal that characterizes authentic religion and healthy political order. Classical Christianity maintains that ultimate meaning lies beyond history while still sanctifying temporal order through participation in divine reality. This tension preserves both human dignity and human limitation, preventing political movements from claiming ultimate authority. The revolutionary collapses this tension by making history itself divine, transforming political action into religious crusade. The movement's success becomes the criterion of truth, its enemies become embodiments of cosmic evil, and its faithful become the elect who will inherit the earth. This explains the peculiar combination of intellectual sophistication and primitive fanaticism that characterizes revolutionary movements throughout history. The same individuals who can construct elaborate theoretical systems become capable of extraordinary cruelty toward those who question their faith. When earthly movements claim divine authority, they must eliminate any evidence that contradicts their claims to ultimate truth. Opposition becomes not merely political disagreement but cosmic rebellion that must be crushed without mercy to preserve the movement's sacred mission. Chapter 3: The Promise of Earthly Paradise and Its Inevitable Betrayal. The central deception of Gnostic politics lies in its promise to achieve within history what classical wisdom understood could only be approached through transcendence of historical limitations. Every revolutionary movement offers its own version of earthly paradise, the classless society where exploitation disappears forever, the thousand-year Reich where racial purity creates perfect harmony, the perfectly just social order where all oppression has been eliminated. This promise captures the deepest human longing for ultimate meaning and directs it toward political action that claims to satisfy transcendent desires through immanent means. I invite you to examine your own experience of political hope and disappointment. Have you ever invested deep emotional energy in a political movement that promised fundamental transformation of human conditions? Notice how the initial enthusiasm, the sense of participating in something historically momentous, gradually encounters the resistance of human nature and institutional reality. The perfect society proves elusive, the new man fails to emerge. The promised liberation produces new forms of oppression. The movement's response is always the same: the resistance proves the need for more radical action. The enemies of progress must be more thoroughly eliminated. The true believers must be more completely purified. The revolution must be more total. This dynamic explains why revolutionary movements inevitably consume their own children with increasing ferocity. The logic of earthly paradise requires that any failure to achieve perfection must result from insufficient commitment rather than impossible goals. When the promised transformation doesn't occur, the fault lies with hidden enemies, secret saboteurs, or the insufficiently revolutionary consciousness of the people themselves. Each disappointment demands a deeper radicalization until the movement destroys the very people it claimed to save, turning salvation into damnation through the pursuit of impossible perfection. The tragedy deepens because revolutionary movements often begin with genuine concern for human suffering and legitimate criticism of existing conditions. Marx's horror at industrial exploitation was real and justified. National Socialist anger at national humiliation and economic chaos had legitimate roots in historical circumstances. Contemporary progressive outrage at historical injustices reflects authentic moral sensitivity to real problems. But the Gnostic response transforms legitimate criticism into totalitarian fanaticism by promising to eliminate the human condition itself rather than working creatively within its limitations. The pattern becomes visible once we understand that the revolutionaries' real enemy is not capitalism, democracy, or traditional civilization, but the structure of human existence itself. The Gnostic cannot accept that meaning requires tension, that growth requires struggle, that love requires freedom to reject love, that justice requires acknowledgement of competing goods. The attempt to eliminate these fundamental tensions through political action destroys the human reality it claims to perfect, creating hell in the name of heaven. Chapter 4: How Gnostic Consciousness Corrupts Intellectual Life. The corruption of intellectual life under Gnostic influence represents one of the most dangerous aspects of revolutionary consciousness, because it destroys the very foundations of rational discourse that make peaceful political resolution possible. When movements claim to possess ultimate truth about reality, they inevitably transform universities, media, and cultural institutions into instruments of ideological indoctrination rather than centers of genuine inquiry. This corruption follows a predictable pattern that I've observed across different historical periods and revolutionary movements. The process begins with the claim that traditional intellectual methods are compromised by their association with oppressive social systems that benefit ruling classes. Marxist intellectuals argued that bourgeois science and philosophy inevitably reflected capitalist interests, making objectivity impossible within capitalist societies. National Socialist thinkers claimed that Jewish influence corrupted German scholarship, requiring purification through racial consciousness. Contemporary critical theorists assert that Western rationality embodies white supremacist assumptions that must be dismantled through alternative ways of knowing. In each case, the revolutionary intellectual presents his gnosis as liberation from ideological blindness that prevents others from seeing truth clearly. This critique of traditional intellectual life contains enough truth to be persuasive to those experiencing genuine problems with existing institutions. Human reason is indeed limited and influenced by historical circumstances, cultural assumptions, and personal interests. Scholarship has sometimes served to justify unjust arrangements and exclude important perspectives. But the Gnostic response doesn't seek to correct these limitations through better scholarship and more rigorous methods. It claims to transcend them through special insight that places the revolutionary intellectual beyond the need for ordinary standards of evidence and logical argument. The result is the emergence of ideological pseudosciences that masquerade as scholarship while serving revolutionary goals rather than truth-seeking. Marxist scientific socialism produced elaborate theories that explained away every failure of communist practice through increasingly complex theoretical constructions. National Socialist racial science created a vast literature that justified policies determined by political expediency rather than empirical investigation. Contemporary gender studies and critical race theory generate endless research that confirms predetermined conclusions about oppression and privilege while dismissing contrary evidence as manifestations of false consciousness. These developments represent more than academic corruption. They threaten the foundations of rational discourse itself upon which civilized society depends. When intellectual life becomes subordinated to revolutionary goals, the very possibility of truth-seeking disappears. Arguments become weapons rather than means of investigation. Evidence becomes propaganda rather than the basis for judgment. Opponents become enemies to be destroyed rather than fellow seekers after truth. The university ceases to be a place where minds meet in pursuit of understanding and becomes a battlefield where ideologies compete for dominance. Chapter 5: The Revolutionaries' Fear of Transcendence. Behind the Gnostic revolutionaries' claim to possess ultimate knowledge lies a deeper spiritual reality that explains the peculiar intensity of revolutionary movements, profound anxiety about transcendence itself. The revolutionary consciousness emerges from an encounter with the mystery of existence that proves too overwhelming to bear in its authentic form. Rather than accepting the tension between human limitation and divine infinity that characterizes authentic religious experience, the Gnostic seeks to eliminate transcendence by claiming to control it through special knowledge that makes him master rather than servant of ultimate reality. I invite you to consider this fundamental paradox. Why do movements that claim to liberate humanity from oppression invariably become oppressive themselves? The answer lies in the revolutionaries' disturbed relationship to the transcendent source of human dignity. Classical civilization understood that human beings participate in divine reality while remaining finite creatures. This participation grounds human dignity without eliminating human limitation, creating the tension that makes moral growth and political improvement possible. The revolutionary cannot tolerate this tension because it threatens his claim to possess ultimate authority. The Gnostic revolutionary experiences transcendence as threat rather than source of meaning and dignity. If ultimate reality exists beyond human control, then human projects remain provisional and incomplete. If divine truth judges human constructions, then no earthly movement can claim final authority over human conscience. If transcendent meaning relativizes all temporal achievements, then revolutionary success cannot provide the ultimate satisfaction that the movement promises. The only solution is to bring transcendence under human control by claiming to possess its secrets and embody its authority. This explains the peculiar combination of grandiose claims and deep insecurity that characterizes revolutionary movements and their leaders. The same leaders who proclaim their movements scientifically inevitable become paranoid about criticism and opposition. The same ideologies that promise historical necessity require constant propaganda to maintain belief among followers. The same systems that claim to embody ultimate truth employ massive surveillance apparatus to monitor their citizens' thoughts and suppress dissent. The revolutionary who claims to possess ultimate knowledge reveals through his behavior that he lacks confidence in his own claims. The revolutionary's fear of transcendence manifests most clearly in his treatment of traditional religious and philosophical symbols that point beyond temporal concerns. These symbols must be either destroyed as superstition or transformed into tools of revolutionary mobilization that serve imminent goals. Christianity becomes liberation theology, focused on political revolution rather than spiritual transformation. Philosophy becomes critical theory, serving ideological purposes rather than love of wisdom. Art becomes social realism, promoting revolutionary consciousness rather than beauty. In each case, the symbol's capacity to point beyond temporal concerns toward transcendent reality must be eliminated or redirected toward revolutionary goals. Yet this desperate attempt to escape transcendence only demonstrates its inescapable reality and the revolutionary's continued dependence on it. The revolutionary who denies God's existence still seeks to play God over human destiny. The movement that rejects eternal truth still claims eternal validity for its own principles and promises. The ideology that dismisses absolute values still demands absolute commitment from its followers and absolute submission to its authority. Chapter 6: Recovering Classical Wisdom about Order and Disorder. The Gnostic corruption of modern consciousness has obscured fundamental insights about human order that remain as valid today as they were for Plato and Aristotle. Insights that provide the intellectual foundation for understanding why revolutionary movements inevitably produce the opposite of their stated intentions. Classical philosophy understood that authentic order emerges from proper orientation toward transcendent reality, while disorder results from attempts to ground ultimate meaning in temporal achievements alone. This wisdom provides the key to understanding the spiritual dynamics that govern political life in every historical period. Plato's analysis of political cycles in the Republic reveals the exact pattern we observe in modern revolutionary movements with startling prescience. When societies lose connection to transcendent justice, the eternal form that judges all temporal arrangements, they inevitably cycle through increasingly degraded forms of order. Democracy becomes license when citizens pursue desire rather than virtue. License becomes anarchy when no common good restrains competing interests. Anarchy becomes tyranny when someone promises to restore order through total control. The tyrant represents the ultimate revolutionary, the man who promises to fulfill every desire while destroying the very conditions that make genuine fulfillment possible. Aristotle's insights into the relationship between individual character and political order prove equally relevant to diagnosing contemporary problems. Authentic politics requires citizens capable of moral excellence, which in turn requires recognition of goods that transcend immediate satisfaction and personal interest. When transcendent orientation disappears from human consciousness, politics becomes mere competition for material advantage and power over others. The revolutionary promise to satisfy material desires without spiritual development inevitably produces neither satisfaction nor development, but corruption of both individual souls and political institutions. The Christian synthesis of classical wisdom with biblical revelation deepened understanding of order's spiritual foundations in ways that illuminate contemporary political pathology. Augustine's analysis of the two cities, the earthly city oriented toward temporal goods and the heavenly city oriented toward eternal truth, explains why revolutionary attempts to create perfect earthly communities must fail. The attempt to eliminate the tension between temporal and eternal destroys both temporal order and eternal orientation, producing neither earthly satisfaction nor heavenly hope but spiritual emptiness disguised as political progress. Medieval political thought, especially in Thomas Aquinas, showed how acknowledgement of transcendent authority actually enhances rather than diminishes legitimate temporal authority. When rulers understand their power as participation in divine governance, they exercise it with restraint and justice because they recognize limits to their authority. When they claim to embody ultimate authority themselves, they become tyrannical because no higher standard judges their actions. The same principle applies to revolutionary movements that claim to represent historical necessity or social justice without acknowledging any authority higher than their own will. This classical tradition offers precious resources for diagnosing and resisting Gnostic disorder without falling into reactionary nostalgia or political cynicism. The insights about transcendence and order can be recovered and applied to contemporary circumstances without requiring return to pre-modern institutional forms or abandonment of legitimate modern achievements. What matters is not specific political arrangements but the spiritual orientation that makes authentic order possible in any historical circumstances. Chapter 7: Spiritual Resistance and the Recovery of Order. The recognition of Gnostic structure in revolutionary movements raises the crucial question that every thoughtful person must confront: how can authentic order be recovered in an age dominated by revolutionary consciousness? The answer cannot be merely political, because the disorder is fundamentally spiritual in nature. Yet neither can it be purely contemplative, because Gnostic movements actively corrupt the institutions and symbols through which spiritual health is transmitted across generations. The path forward requires understanding how spiritual resistance can create conditions for political renewal. The path of resistance begins with what I call anamnesis, the recovery of fundamental experiences of order that revolutionary consciousness has obscured but cannot entirely destroy. Every human being has experienced moments of genuine transcendence, encounters with beauty that lift the soul beyond temporal concerns, moral insights that reveal obligations beyond self-interest, intellectual discoveries that participate in eternal truth, religious experiences that open consciousness to divine reality. These experiences provide the foundation for resisting Gnostic claims about reality because they reveal dimensions of existence that no revolutionary ideology can explain or control. Personal resistance requires cultivating what I term islands of order, in the midst of cultural disorder, spaces where authentic relationships to transcendent reality can be maintained despite the surrounding confusion. These islands exist wherever genuine human relationships develop, in family life that prioritizes love over convenience, in friendships that seek truth over ideological agreement, in scholarly pursuit that serves wisdom over career advancement, in spiritual practice that opens the soul to divine reality rather than using religion for political purposes. Such islands cannot isolate themselves from the larger culture, but they can preserve and transmit experiences of order that make cultural renewal possible. The university, properly understood, represents one of the most important potential islands of order in modern society. When genuine intellectual inquiry occurs, when students and teachers pursue truth together rather than serving ideological agendas, the university participates in the eternal dialogue between human reason and transcendent reality. This is why Gnostic movements always seek to capture educational institutions first, transforming them from centers of learning into instruments of indoctrination. Recovering the university's authentic mission requires individuals willing to resist ideological pressure and maintain commitment to truth-seeking regardless of political consequences. Cultural resistance requires recovering the symbolic language through which transcendent experiences have been articulated in Western civilization. The great works of literature, philosophy, and theology remain available despite revolutionary attempts to reinterpret them according to contemporary ideological categories. Reading Dante, Shakespeare, or the Bible with openness to their spiritual dimensions provides resources for understanding human existence that no Gnostic ideology can match. These works preserve insights about order and disorder that remain valid across historical periods because they participate in eternal truth. Political resistance emerges naturally from spiritual and cultural recovery rather than preceding it. Citizens who have experienced authentic order can recognize the fraudulent character of revolutionary promises. They understand that human dignity depends on transcendent foundation rather than political achievement. They know that genuine justice requires acknowledgement of moral reality that exists independent of human will. Such citizens cannot be easily manipulated by ideological appeals because they possess standards of judgment that transcend political categories. The recovery of order cannot be achieved through revolutionary means that would simply replace one form of Gnosticism with another. It requires patient cultivation of spiritual health in individuals and communities willing to bear witness to transcendent reality in the midst of temporal confusion. Such witness may seem ineffective compared to revolutionary activism, but it represents the only path toward authentic renewal of human order that respects both human dignity and human limitation. Conclusion. The Gnostic structure that underlies modern revolutionary movements reveals itself most clearly in their common promise: human nature can be fundamentally transformed through political action. An earthly paradise can be achieved through possession of the right knowledge and implementation of the correct policies. This promise has captivated intellectuals and masses alike across different historical periods because it responds to genuine human longing for transcendence while appearing to offer practical solutions to temporal problems. Yet, as we have seen through careful analysis, every attempt to immanentize the escheaton produces tyranny rather than liberation, spiritual emptiness rather than fulfillment, hell rather than heaven. The alternatives to Gnostic politics are not cynicism about political improvement or nostalgic return to pre-modern arrangements that ignore legitimate modern achievements. Classical wisdom about order remains available to those willing to undertake the patient work of anamnesis, recovering experiences of transcendent reality that Gnostic consciousness has obscured but cannot permanently destroy. Such recovery enables recognition of authentic political possibilities that respect both human dignity and human limitation without falling into either utopianism or despair. The future of civilized order depends on individuals capable of living consciously in the tension between temporal responsibility and eternal orientation. This tension cannot be eliminated through revolutionary transformation, but it can be lived creatively through participation in transcendent reality that grounds human dignity while acknowledging human finitude. In our time of revolutionary confusion, such participation represents both spiritual necessity and political hope for authentic renewal.